And welcome back. The Black Man Can Incorporated is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to curating, creating, and amplifying authentic stories, events, and programs celebrating and exemplifying limitless capacities of black men and boys. And we've got joining us now the founder, Chief Visionary Officer of the Black Man Can Incorporated, Dr. Brandon Frame, with us, and good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. Really honored to be here.
No, listen, it's an opportunity to have a conversation that we really need to have.
Yes.
Which is really about, empowerment, right? Mm-hmm. And really how we can talk about empowering black men, empowering black families. But when you came up with the Black Man Can, right, what was in your mind?
M.K. Asante is one of my favorite scholars, and he says, once you make an observation, you have an obligation. So I made an observation that black men and boys need to see positive images of themselves and need to have their stories told. So therefore, I had an obligation to create it. And that was in 2010 that it started as a blog, and then over these last 14 years, it's just evolved as I've evolved as well in terms of like when I first started, it was solely like youth focused, but I was 22, 23. That's what you're thinking about. You just graduated from college, you want to impact the community, but then it's grown to meet the social emotional needs of black men and boys, to talk about fatherhood, to talk about marriage, and so many other topics that are important to black men and boys across the spectrum.
When we talk about that social emotional concept, right, I think there's so much that we could, that's a whole show all by itself,
Yes.
right? But when we really look at it, if you don't deal with it, you're not dealing with us. That's basically what I tell people all the time, because there's so much. So unpack for us a little bit, right? What do you find to be some of those great social emotional, issues that we really need to address to find ourselves being in a more successful place?
Yeah, well, I think first it's talking about what is social emotional learning and emotional intelligence. And social emotional learning is the acquisition of the skills that allow for you to be emotionally intelligent, so that then we can talk about what does it mean to have equity, what does it mean for us to think about the skills necessary for us to be productive, whole, healthy men, so that we can be the leaders in our community, in our households, and for society as large.
So I know that you do this, you've done this, and so podcasting and talking, right, and getting it through. What are the conversations that we need to be having?
I think there's multiple things that we can do. One is just talking about us in terms of just seeing positive images and narratives. We know that popular media might not necessarily paint us in the most positive light, so we need to be having conversations about how we champion positive images. We need to be having conversations about what does it mean to be emotionally intelligent. Many of us grew up in an era where it was boys don't cry, man up, and we have to kind of move away from that, right? Especially with the next generation, and thinking about how we actually become comprehensive men, right? Mm-hmm. And what does it mean when you talk about masculinity, and it's not just about being brave and providing and protecting, but also what does it mean to be vulnerable, compassionate, and have empathy, and so that you be a comprehensive man. Then we get into social issues. When we talk about mass incarceration, we're talking about police brutality. All these things are multiple topics that we have to discuss when it comes to black men and boys.
So you got a few things going on, and I want to talk a little bit about it, because you got a lot going on. If you don't know, check him out. Really, he does. Talk about the Raising Kings campaign.
Raising Kings campaign. Black Man Can is a nonprofit organization, and as we know, you got to have some money to do the work.
Right.
And so the Raising Kings campaign is an opportunity for people to donate to the Black Man Can. Whatever dollar amount that will help support our programming, our Building a Better Brother Summit, the My First Tie experience, the Black Man Can Awards. All these things are different programming and that we do that gets support from people who donate to the organization.
Yeah, one of the things my first time. I really want to hear about that, because I'll tell you about that in a minute. But go, tell me about My First Tie.
Yeah, so My First Tie, the backstory here for context is one of our programs is the Building a Better Brother Summit, but it's primarily focused on grades 6 through 12. And so I had a mom call me and said, "Hey, Brandon, my son has to come, but he's in the 4th grade." And I said, "Okay, that I'm gonna tell this mom, his black mom, that her son can't come to the programming." And so he came. And he was an awesome young man, but after the end of the whole summit, he comes to me and says, "How come you don't do this with my friends?" And when I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I'm not in middle school and I'm not in high school, so why don't you do this type of work with my friends?" And I was like, I didn't really have an answer. And so that prompted me to think about what would that look like. And so that became a children's book called My First Tie that I wrote and co-authored alongside Tanae Deneen Eskridge, where it's about little Dell and his journey to tie his tie for the first time. And then what we do is, that's what I do in elementary school. So I'll go and read to students. We'll talk about the different concepts in the book around honesty, around positive self-identity, and then they receive ties. So I read the book and they also receive ties. And we do it in multiple ways. We've done it where I'll go get the high school boys, right? We have affirmation cards at the Black Man Can. So we'll do some stuff with the high school boys, but then with those boys, we'll go, with those boys, we'll go read to the young men and the elementary school. So there's multiple ways that we do this My First Tie experience, giving students an opportunity to learn how to tie a tie, see positive images, and also promote the importance of literacy.
Then we get down to 1,000 ties.
Yes. 1,000 Ties is, we do it maybe twice a year, which is our mixer, happy hour event, if you will. And people come, but you don't pay to come, you bring ties. So you come and you donate the ties. Those are the same ties that are gifted to students from across the country when we're doing the Building a Better Brother Summit, or we are doing the My First Tie experience. And at that My First Tie, we do like some cool drinks, like we'll have the double Windsor Punch.
Really?
Right?
Okay.
You know, or there's the Mai Tai, so we call it the Tie Mai Tai.
Right.
Just to add that
right.
fun aspect to the event. But people come and have a good time, but really it's a good time with bringing ties to, that we donate to.
God called me, I want in on that.
All right.
I got 400 ties at home.
All right.
I can bring a few. So when you really look at the connection of young men into adulthood, obviously having the right resources, having the right kind of background and support really makes the difference. Talk to me about a little bit the area of that development, right? Because, you know, we don't have a lot sometimes in the area of investment by people on the outside. You're bridging the gap by way of investment. I know you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about. You know, right, this could be a whole show.
Right?
On
Come back again.
itself,
We got
right?
you. I got you. We'll tell my producer already gets done.
But thinking about our boys and their development and what's needed, we really hyper focus on the social emotional development of the students, of our young men, and thinking about that, even and as well as positive self-identity. So. And a lot of times when you go talk to young men, one of the things that you will hear is like, oh, I want to be a basketball player, or NFL, I want to be in entertainment, right? But one reason for that is that that's what you see. If that's mostly the images that you see, I was once that young boy. You couldn't tell me I wasn't going to the NBA, right? That was that. And what I learned over that is actually sometimes I'm not even upset necessarily anymore about that, right? Because if you want to put the effort in to try and be a professional athlete, I can take transferable skills from that effort. What I found in our work and what we really work on in the positive self-identity is that there are boys who don't aspire to be athletes or entertainers. They want to have their own TV show. They want to be photographers. They want to be creators. But when you ask them about that profession, they don't say it with the same confidence that boy who wants to go pro. But he says it with the confidence because he sees it. He's like, I know the pathway. I know what I want to do. When boys that you meet and they want to do other professions, they don't know Black men who do those things. So there's not as much confidence when I want to be a photographer, I want to be a video game designer. I've never seen that. And so in our programming, we're always thinking about how we develop the optimistic thinking, create the pathways, but develop that confidence by ensuring that they meet Black men who are doing the things that they aspire to do, because then in turn, they have that confidence when they say, I'm going to be this. You can't tell them nothing else. Just like when you talk to that young man who does want to be an athlete or an entertainer, but part of that is because that's what he sees.
Yeah, I think about one of our friends here on our show, Sharielle Smith. She's the editor-in-chief of Laptop Magazine, but she actually gets paid to like play games, watch them, do this, right? And I think there's something to be said. I've said this before. There's an old saying that my people perish for a lack of knowledge, but I also believe that people perish for a lack of exposure.
Absolutely.
And so when we talk about young men and that exposure, how about that exposure gap, for you? What made the difference for you? Because you're a Morehouse man. Got to give a shout out to Morehouse, right? But you were exposed to high levels of education, opportunities, stuff like that. How much has that made a difference for you?
Exposure was huge, and one of the things that I did that we also teach our young men is using being a kid being a teenager to your advantage. And one of the things that I did was, the things that I was interested in, I actually would send emails. What you find about adults, most adults like to talk about themselves, right? And so if you reach out to them, like let's just say a young man who was 15 sent you an email, said, you know, I've been following you, I've seen the work that you do, I would love to come shadow you. Most likely, you're not gonna say no. It's just a matter of when they can come shadow you,
Right.
but it's not gonna be a no. And so teaching young men to also use their voice and reach out to black men, and sometimes it might not be a person who's a black male, too, because the first person I did was an anchor in Connecticut. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a sports journalist, sports broadcast journalist, and so I reached out to the local NBC 30 person, and then they said, oh yeah, absolutely, and then that's how I was like, oh, I really want to do this. Ultimately chose a different path, but was able to get a chance to see that, and so getting young men to create the exposure for themselves and using their voice, develop the confidence to almost develop the skill as well as to ask for help, ask for assistance. A lot of times as boys and men, we are grown up to not, right? You got to figure it out. And it's like, no, there's asking for help, asking for assistance, finding that mentor so that they can guide you. Because one thing we also talk about to the boys is when it comes to mentoring, if it took me 20 steps, it's supposed to take you 10. I'm not being an effective mentor unless it takes you half the time it took me to do the same things.
Right. But, oh, God, gosh, that's another conversation all by itself. I mean, you just hit that. Because I think that there's a lot of us who don't want that, right? Because they want them to take the 20 steps. Unfortunately, there's two generations that say, you know, I want you to do it the same way that I've done it, right? Have the same experience I had. And I think that's crazy. I do, too. My joy is watching people get there faster.
Yeah.
Right? My joy is seeing you get it. I have a personal joy of saying, listen, if I'm invested into you and you get it, that does me great. But I don't think that everybody has that same kind of...
The intergenerational mantle passing.
Yes.
There's some work that we have to do there.
Right.
And I think also, too, I think there is, when we're talking about the idea of being a comprehensive man, one thing that we have to take time to really delve into as men, period, is our ego, right? Because what you just shared, that's a lot of ego right there. It's like, no, and it's like, hey, ego will keep communities from thriving, right? I was I watched a few movies. I watched the Rustin movie.
Yeah.
Did you watch Rustin? And then the other one right now, they have the MLKX Genius.
Yeah.
And you can watch, even as they're showing the movie, you can see this ego thing come up. You see Adam Clayton Powell and with Dr. King, right? There was so much ego just as men, and the March on Washington might have not happened if people couldn't get out of the ego.
Absolutely.
Right? So think about just things in life that wouldn't have happened, and there was so much ego involved to almost keep it from happening, or even keep things from being greater than what they could have been.
Yeah. I actually sat with John Lewis, and he told me at the March on Washington, there were 10 people who spoke, and he was number 8 out of 10. Dr. King was, 10, of course, 10 of 10. And I just was saying to myself, I could imagine thinking about all these guys. I should be number 5. I should be number 4, right? But the reality is, if a lot of stuff, but we're grateful that it actually did.
Absolutely.
It did happen. We live I say that we live right now in a culture right now that is based on individualism, right? Everything that we do is based on individualism, right? You got a job ahead of you now because now we have a job. Because I'm interviewing you, I'm saying you,
yeah.
right? You got a job because as culture has moved towards this place of individualism, gone is the family dynamic. How do we connect the dots?
You know, all these topics are they're like their own shows.
Yeah, right.
Right? Because I think one thing that we've moved to an individualistic society, but that's also very Eurocentric, right? And so what does it look like? I think about rites of passage programs that we should create for boys and girls, black boys and girls, and we really tap into being the collectivist culture that we actually come from. Because I think when you get into Eurocentric views, they tend to be individualistic, right? Even when you look at what Native American cultures were and African cultures were, individualism was brought to them. That's not how our cultures were. That's not how our communities thrived. And so I think there's an opportunity to have a conversation around what does it look like to bring back collectivist cultures and how do we actually work together to allow for our communities to thrive, because it's only in doing that that we'll see the liberation that we want in our communities.
Yeah. Okay, I push the envelope a little bit further because I think like when you talk about individualism, I think about right now, young black men and the fact of the household and a fragmented household. You're trying to get people to stay connected, but yet and still society is pushing you to have your own voice, to do this, to do that. It's very hard to maintain a family dynamic in the middle of this individualistic society. And when you start to look at it, it seems like more and more the family dynamic is broken and in need of huge restoration.
Yeah, I think, so then that goes to storytelling, right? And that's one thing that we do at The Black Man Can. If you follow our Instagram page, when it comes to our events, our Valentine's Day campaign that we just ran is thinking about, again, about collectivist culture, about community, about how we work together to achieve the goals that we want in our households, but also for the community in which we live in. And I think the stories aren't necessarily always told of that. So the stories that we do see that are promoted are about people and being individual, but there are communities and there are people who are doing it in a community, in a collectivist way, but we don't necessarily tell those stories of success and how things are functioning in that way. And the more we tell those stories, the more we see. One of my favorite movies is Monsters, Inc., right? And so Monsters, Inc., I think it's an example of why the Black Man Can exist and why we do the work that we do. And Monsters, Inc., at the beginning, you find that the monsters are trying to scare the little kids, and then they get their screams, and that's how they power their community. And then the monsters realize it's not about that. It's actually about making them laugh. It's about making them happy. And the energy that comes from that is 10 times greater. What would it look like if we saw more of that when it comes to the media that we tell and the stories that we tell? Because we know what the world looks like, because sometimes people look on the news and just say, oh, what is the world coming to? What would it look like when it's different, it's an inverse of what we see? And what would that do to communities and people in terms of what they think where they would think the world is going and what is happening? It's not to say that crazy things and horrible things aren't happening, but part of that is the storytelling that we're doing around what is happening.
Right. So if people want to get connected to the work that you're doing, partner with it in some kind of way, how do they go about doing that?
You can come to www.TheBlackManCan.com. From there, you'll see more about our organization, our website, all the stories that we're telling. You can click the link to the foundation, so then you can get to the nonprofit side and see all the work that we're doing across the communities. You can follow us on Instagram. We've built up over 1 million followers, so that lets you know that people want to see positive images and narratives. So you can follow us there and along our journey to make sure we tell the positive stories, amplify, create, and curate programs and stories focusing on Black men and boys.
What about the podcasting, man?
So we're gonna launch the podcast in April. It's called The Men's Den. So we'll have to have you come on as a guest.
I love it.
So we got the podcast. We got the Black Man Can Awards coming soon. We also have our flower affirmation wall event, which is celebrating the comprehensiveness of Black men putting masculine affirmations, but done in flowers to celebrate that duality.
Wow.
So we have a lot of things coming, and so definitely want everybody to be tapped in because we're gonna do the good work.
That's it. Dr. Brandon Frame.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being with us, brother. You gotta come back.
Absolutely, I would love to.
All right, we're gonna make it work. All right?